It's time for
On the Victory Homefront
with Jamie. It's the end of April 1942. Just days ago, Americans could walk into a store and buy sugar without limits, but now they can't. Hello to all the Rosies and Homefront Joes out there, and welcome back to another episode of On the Victory Homefront. The last couple of weeks, we have really been diving into the weeks coming up to the registration process for Book 1 of the ration system here in the United States for World War II. And this week, it's still a week ramping up to that first ration week. Now, on April 27th, 1942, something quiet but important happened. It was the last day that Americans could buy sugar freely. No stamps, no limits, no system. But after that, the rules changed. April 27th, it wasn't just another day at the store. It was the end of something familiar. For the last time, customers could walk in and buy as much sugar as they wanted. No restrictions. There's no tracking. There was no limits. But then that moment was gone. After April 27th, that stopped. And it's not because sugar disappeared. It didn't. Sugar did not disappear. But for the average shopper, it may as well have. Because from that point until May 5th, they could no longer walk into the store and buy sugar the way you always had. As a matter of fact, you couldn't buy sugar at all. The system paused. And that pause wasn't accidental. It was intentional. If rationing had started immediately, it wouldn't have worked. People would have rushed stores, shelves would have been emptied, and the system would have failed before it began. So instead, the government did something different. They stopped sugar sales first, so they could restart them under control. They paused the system so they could rebuild it. Newspapers at the time made it clear this wasn't uncertainty, it was a plan. In fact, New York Times report from late April 1942 confirmed that sugar rationing would begin on May 5th, and it was set by the Office of Price Administration. And I'm going to do a little something different with this podcast. I actually want to read the article to you. This article was originally printed on April 23rd, 1942. And here's what it states. Washington, April 22nd. Sugar rationing in the United States was definitely set today for May 5th by the Office of Price Administration, which fixed the normal allowance to each person at a trifle more than half a pound a week. Restaurants and other food services will be limited to 50% of the amount of sugar used during the corresponding month last year, or the amount used in March if records of consumption a year ago are not available. Bakers, manufacturers of confectionery, ice cream, dairy products, preserves, bottled beverages, desserts, and other specialties get a higher allotment of 70% of prior consumption. Individual and family unit consumers are asked to register in elementary schools from May 4th to 7th and will receive war ration books permitting purchase of 1 pound of sugar with each stamp during 4 periods ending June 27th, covering 7 weeks and 4 days. Allowances after June 27th will be set sometime before that date in the light of the supply situation then existing and expected. Here are the rules for registration. 1 adult in a family unit should register and apply for War Ration Book 1. For each member, including those temporarily absent, persons unable to register because of illness or other incapacity may be registered by proxy. Others who, because of transportation difficulties, find it a hardship to buy sugar in the quantities allowed in each ration period may apply to their local rationing board for certificates authorizing them to buy at one time the total allowance in a 4-week period. Children born after the registration dates will be entitled to a normal ration after being registered by their parents. Rationing books must be returned by relatives or custodians within 10 days after the death of any registered person. Persons inducted into the armed forces or those leaving the United States for more than 30 days must surrender their books to their local boards. Persons who become confined to an institution for a period likely to exceed 10 days must leave their books with the administrative head of the institution during their confinement. Consumers unable to receive a ration book at the time of registration because they then own more than 6 pounds of sugar may obtain books from their local boards only after the commencement of the latest ration periods during which stamps become valid, having a weight value equal to the excess sugar supply owned on May 4th, 1942. Members of the armed forces who eat at home should register in the same way as civilians, and a member of the armed forces on furlong status for a period of more than 1 week is entitled to a book. Consumers who, by reason of illness, require more sugar than the ration allowance may present to their local boards a special form of application, accompanied by a doctor's certificate stating the additional amount required and the reason therefor. OPA officials said they had endeavored to reduce as much as possible the hardship which would result from loss of rationing books, but replacements will not be made until after 2 months from the date of application. Officials also warn that to make a false application is a criminal offense and that violators of any of the sugar regulations might be punished by a maximum fine of $10,000 and imprisonment of a maximum of 1 year. So it was taken very seriously. Industrial and institutional users of sugar who will register at high schools Tuesday and Wednesday will receive either a provisional allowance or an allotment to cover their sugar needs to June 30th. Provisional allowances will be determined by multiplying the number of units of such products which the owner estimates will be produced in the registering unit during the period for which the application is being made by the quantity of sugar which is permitted as at the maximum amount per unit of the product. The War Production Board issued a supplementary order today to the Sugar Conservation Order permitting receivers of refined sugar to anticipate the May quotas by accepting, between now and May 1st, 50% of the amount of sugar they used or resold in May 1941. The order was issued at the request of OPA to lay a foundation for the rationing system. The May quotas have not yet been announced. Then it says, Lee S. Buckingham, acting Federal Rationing Administrator for New York City, said yesterday that it might be necessary to delay sugar sales to ration book holders here until May 6th because of the large number of domestic users who must be registered and the necessity of spacing registrations to prevent an overtaxing of facilities. And so that is the article that was printed in the New York Times on April 23rd, 1942. So that gives you a bit of an insight there as we go into getting ready to register. So you can see how that information was definitely put out there for the masses, for the public to really understand this process. And so now at this point, we know that Americans weren't just waiting, not just hearing things that might be happening or when. They were now waiting for something that had been decided and was released to the public for their knowledge. So what happened next? Well, during that gap, several things had to happen, and it had to happen quickly. The government needed to know how much sugar was already in American homes, and they needed to distribute the ration books. They needed stores to understand the rules, and they needed the public to be ready. Because once the system started, it had to work, which meant when registration began, you couldn't just walk in and figure it out. This is what we stated last week in last week's episode. You had to arrive ready with the names of everyone in your household, your address, and one very important detail, how much sugar you had at home. Because you weren't just showing up, you were showing up prepared. And you were showing up with the number of pounds of sugar you had at home. So why did that number matter? Well, that number had consequences because under the rules, each person was allowed to have about 2 pounds of sugar on hand without penalty. But if you had more than that, those extra pounds mattered. And you would pay for it. For every pound over the limit, a stamp could be taken from your ration book before you even used it, which means the more sugar you already had, the less you may get later. And that kind of created a problem for every household because how accurate are you? How precise do you need to be and what counts as sugar? And if it's too high, are you going to lose stamps? The system depended on honesty, but it also tested it. But so families had to sit down and think of how many people they needed to register and how much sugar do they use. Not that that was going to matter when they registered because they had a set amount they were going to get, but what it was doing was creating them to figure out how they were going to get by. If they used more than half a pound of sugar per person per week, how are they going to tweak their usage so that they will not run out of sugar? So it's really what that comes down to. And then I'm sure they're thinking about how is this going to affect our baking? How is this going to affect our preserving? And for the first time, food wasn't just something that you bought, it was something you planned. And, a lot of things could go wrong as you're getting ready to register. You could miscount what you have, you could forget someone, you could misunderstand the rules, you could report the wrong amount, and every mistake had consequences. So before rationing even began, it was already shaping what came next. And once families had done all of this, there was nothing left to do but wait. They had measured how much sugar was in their home and they gathered what they needed to report. But they didn't yet know exactly what would happen next. They only knew what they had, but not yet what that exactly meant. Because the next step wouldn't happen at home, it would happen in the schools, in gymnasiums, in lines. And for the first time, Americans would step into the system together. And so by the end of April 1942, Americans stood in a moment of transition. They had already bought sugar for the last time without limits, and they had already measured what they had. And now they were waiting for a system that would change how they bought something as simple as sugar. Next week, we're going to dive into the actual registration process itself. We're going to look at how it was done, maybe some of the questions that were on the registration form. I did say in earlier episodes, application. I think that was just an easier word for me to remember. If you registered, you were going to get a ration book. It was needed. It was the only way to obtain your sugar. And that's what book one was known as. It was known as the sugar book. So I hope you'll join me next week as we continue going in to the very first rationing date for World War II. And I want to thank you all for listening and tuning in. I appreciate all my listeners so incredibly much. If you really enjoy my podcast and you think some of your friends and family may, please share with them. I would love for my audience to grow. This is such a passion of mine to share the World War II Homefront from here in America, and I would just love to be able to reach more people. So I want to thank you again for joining me, and I hope that you will join me next week. And until next time, my friends, remember, victory is in the everyday.